You stood at that doorway where the smell of smoked pork hit you before you crossed the threshold, watching her move through that kitchen like she had memorized every inch of it, because she had. Here are 30 foods that prove the 1960s had the best soul food in American history. Smothered chicken was a Sunday centerpiece in most black households of the 1960s, and it announced the week was over and the family was home. A whole chicken cut into pieces, seasoned deep with salt, black pepper, garlic powder, and paprika, dredged in flour and browned in a cast iron skillet until golden. Then the chicken came out and the gravy went in. Onions, bell pepper, stock scraped up from the bottom where all the flavor had pooled. The chicken went back in, the lid went on, and the heat went low for an hour. By the time it was done, the meat had given everything to the gravy, and the gravy had given it back. In kitchens from Birmingham to Chicago, this was the dish that made you feel like someone meant for you to be there. You can still find the recipe. What you cannot find, what no amount of technique will replace, is the woman who stood at that stove and made you feel like the most important person in the world just by handing you a plate. Crackling bread belonged to the kitchens that made it, and you either grew up knowing it or you didn't. When a hog was slaughtered in the fall, the skin was cut into strips and rendered until the fat cooked out, and what remained were cracklings, brittle, salty, savory pieces that crunched between your back teeth. The best went straight into cornbread batter, cornmeal, buttermilk, an egg, and fresh cracklings folded through, then poured into a screaming hot skillet until the bottom crust turned deep brown and the inside stayed soft. The cracklings distributed through the bread like hidden pockets, some crisp at the edge, some soft near the center. By the 1960s, this bread was already slipping away. The hog slaughter was becoming a memory as families moved north and supermarkets replaced the smokehouse. You had to know someone who still made it. You had to be from somewhere specific, a place where the cold November air still smelled like wood smoke and rendered fat on a Saturday morning. She started them the night before, always the night before, because a deviled egg made the morning of a church supper was an egg with no character. Yolks came out and went through a fork, mixed with Duke's mayonnaise, yellow mustard, a little sweet pickle relish, paprika on top, and something else she never told anyone. Every cook had a something else, and knowing what it was meant you were trusted enough to be taught. At every black gathering in the 1960s, church supper, family reunion, repast after a burial, deviled eggs appeared on the same church plate with the divots shaped just right, always gone before the main dishes were touched. There was an unspoken rule: you did not take the last one without checking that the person who made them had already eaten. She always made sure everyone else ate first anyway, and now the plate sits in a cabinet and no one remembers what she put in them to make them taste the way they did. Canned salmon cost almost nothing, and in the hands of a cook who knew what she was doing, it became something that tasted like it cost everything. Drained, picked clean of bones, mixed with crushed crackers or cornmeal, a beaten egg, chopped onion, and black pepper, shaped into patties by hand and fried in hot oil until each side went brown and the outside crackled when you touched it with a fork. The Florida Avenue Grill in Washington, D.C., one of the oldest continuously operating soul food restaurants in the world, served salmon cakes from its earliest days alongside collard greens and chitterlings. At home, they were a Tuesday staple, quick, filling, cheap, and good enough to make you forget they were any of those things. The cook knew when the oil was right not by temperature, but by sound, a steady, confident sizzle the moment the patty hit the pan. If it sputtered slow, the oil was cold. If it screamed, it was too hot. She knew the difference in her sleep, and she is gone now, and no one in that kitchen has made them since. Before the Sunday plate was assembled, there was a pot going since morning, and if you came through the back door in the afternoon and didn't smell it, something had gone wrong. Mustard greens carry a sharper bite than collards, more astringent and almost peppery raw, and that edge is what made them worth the hour they spent in the pot with the smoked ham hock, onion, and garlic. West African cooks had been boiling leafy greens with meat and seasoning for centuries before enslaved cooks brought the same technique south. By the 1960s, the method hadn't changed, only the address had. The potlikker pooling at the bottom was rich with vitamin A, C, and K, broth that plantation owners had poured away, not understanding what they were discarding. The old women in those kitchens understood. They saved every drop. Pinto beans and fatback was the dish that nobody bragged about and everybody loved. Dried beans, soaked overnight, started on the stove before anyone was fully awake with a thick slab of fatback, salted, cured pork fat from the back of the hog, going in whole so its fat could slowly melt into the broth. Onion, garlic, a little black pepper, and 4 hours of low heat. The beans softened into something so deeply flavored that a bowl over white rice with a square of cornbread was all anyone needed. The secret was the salt. You never added it early because salt at the beginning toughens the bean skin and keeps the center hard. You waited until the beans had given in completely, until the broth had thickened on its own. Only then. In Jim Crow era, black households across the South, this dish appeared weekly, not because nothing else was available, but because no one had yet invented a reason to stop making it. That is a kind of loyalty that belongs only to the best food. There is a difference between a lima bean and a butter bean that cannot be explained to someone who didn't grow up eating both. Butter beans, the large, pale, starchy variety, braised low and slow in broth with smoked turkey wings or smoked neck bones until the skins went translucent and the insides turned silky. The broth thickened around them without a roux or a thickener, just the starch from the beans releasing over time, the smoke from the meat settling in. On fall weeknights, this was what sat in the middle of the table while the family came in from work and school. It required only a bowl and the woman who had been cooking it all afternoon. She was the kind of cook who could tell by feel when the beans had crossed from done to right. Not the same thing. Done meant cooked through. Right meant ready. Softer at the edge, holding shape in the center, the broth at exactly that thickness. She is gone. The beans still exist. The right of it left with her. Smothered cabbage was Monday food, and Monday meant the pot going on before anyone asked what was for dinner. Cabbage cut into thick wedges, a piece of smoked neck bone, just enough water to cover the bottom, lid on, heat low. What happened over the next hour was slow. The cabbage releasing sweetness, the pork releasing salt and smoke, the two trading places until the cabbage was tender and darkened at the edges and tasted nothing like it started as. The cook monitored by sound. Steady low steam meant it was working. Silence meant you added water and checked the bottom before anything scorched. This wasn't a dish designed to impress anyone. It cost almost nothing, fed 6 people, and tasted like someone had spent all morning on it. Someone had. Stewed tomatoes and okra was among the oldest dishes on the soul food table. Okra arrived in the Americas aboard slave ships. Enslaved African women hid the seeds in their braided hair on the Atlantic crossing, knowing they were carrying something they could not afford to lose. That act of preservation produced, generations later, a dish as honest as any in the Southern kitchen. Tomatoes, broken down in a wide skillet with sliced okra, onion, garlic, and bacon grease, cooked slow until the okra thickened everything into a glossy stew, served hot over white rice. Children in those kitchens learned that okra has two personalities, soft when stewed, crisp when fried, and the cook's job was to honor both. The stewed version is rarely made that way anymore, and there is no reason for that except that the women who made it right are gone. If the weeknight dishes asked for patience, chicken, and waffles asked for something different, a kind of joyful precision that only certain cooks had worked all the way out. Food historian Adrian Miller documented that in Maryland's black communities, cooks fried chicken in shallow fat in a covered pan, frying and steaming it at the same time, producing meat crisp on the surface and startlingly tender inside, and served it with waffles. The tradition traveled north to Harlem, where Sylvia's restaurant opened in 1962 and became an institution, and where chicken and waffles was the thing you ordered after church or after a show or at 2 a.m. when the night wasn't ready to end. The combination sounds like a collision and eats like a right decision. The salt and fat of the chicken against the soft, sweet waffle, each one sharpening the other. You knew which kitchen made it right in your neighborhood. That knowledge was never written anywhere. It was passed by eating it once and knowing you would have to go back. In Montgomery, Alabama, a cook named Georgia Gilmore ran a soul food operation out of her home called the Club from Nowhere, feeding civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., and using the proceeds to fund the Montgomery bus boycott through the late 1950s and into the 60s. Her stuffed bell peppers were among the dishes her customers returned for. Peppers hollowed and packed with seasoned ground meat, cooked rice, diced tomato, and onion, baked in tomato sauce until the pepper walls softened in the filling set. The technique of stuffing vegetables with grain and meat is documented across West African cooking traditions. In American kitchens, it became something new, the seasoning built in layers at every stage. To the meat when it browned, to the tomato as it reduced, to the dish as it went into the oven. What came out was food that had been thought about and tended. At Georgia Gilmore's table, feeding people, well, was itself a form of resistance. That is not a sentiment applied after the fact. That is exactly what it was. Red beans and rice was Monday food in New Orleans, and the tradition was so rooted in black Creole life that it outlasted every migration north. Monday was wash day. The women spent the morning over washboards and tubs and could not stand at a stove. Red kidney beans, soaked overnight, went into a heavy pot with the ham hock saved from Sunday's dinner, with onion, celery, bell pepper, garlic, bay leaf, thyme, and cayenne. The pot sat low and unattended for hours, the beans absorbing smoke and spice until they broke down at the edges and thickened the broth on their own. Food historians trace this dish directly to Senegalese thiebou nieba, a rice and bean preparation enslaved Africans brought across the Atlantic and adapted to Louisiana's land and pork. By the 1960s, families in Detroit and Chicago were making it every Monday without ever having seen New Orleans because their grandmothers had said that was simply what Monday meant. If red beans and rice was what fed the family, potlikker was what nobody let go to waste. The broth left in the pot after greens cooked down, dark, smoky, thick with rendered fat from a ham hock, was poured into a bowl and brought to the table alongside cornbread, not for dipping, for drinking. Enslaved cooks and their descendants understood for generations what nutritional science confirmed much later. Potlikker is dense with vitamin A, C, and K, along with iron and folate, the precise nutrients missing from a diet of scraps and staples. A 1931 dispute in American newspapers between Georgia Governor Lamartine Hardman and journalist Julian Harris over how to eat potlikker, dunked cornbread, or crumbled became national news, a measure of how central this broth was to Southern identity. The difference was that in Black households, potlikker was never a novelty or a debate. It was nutrition, it was necessity, it was the best part of the pot, and anyone who poured it down the drain had not been raised right. Hogmaw was the pig's stomach, and in the kitchens that cooked it right, it was treated with the same attention as any roast. Cleaned thoroughly, rinsed again and again, rubbed with salt and vinegar, then stuffed with seasoned sausage or cubed potato, onion, and cabbage, and slow roasted until the stomach wall went tender and the stuffing had absorbed every surrounding flavor. The African American Registry documents Hogmaw as a direct inheritance from the plantation kitchen, where enslaved cooks received the offal and were expected to make something from it. They did. By the 1960s, Hogmaw was still being made in households where the knowledge of how to work every part of the animal was passed not as hardship, but as skill. The cook who could do it right was not someone who settled. Time equals 1 second / greater than Brunswick stew. The old way bears almost no resemblance to what shows up in cans at the grocery store. Before commercial chicken replaced everything, this was a wild game stew, squirrel, rabbit, or whatever the woods provided, cooked low and slow in an iron pot with corn cut fresh from the cob, lima beans, okra, and tomatoes, all of it breaking down over hours into something thick and dark and deeply savory. The dish is claimed by both Brunswick County, Virginia, and Brunswick, Georgia, but the version that fed Black families across the rural South in the 1940s and 50s was made from necessity and kept alive by memory. You started it in the morning and ate it at midday. The stew rewarded patience and punished shortcuts. Let the heat get too high and the beans scorch to the bottom. Keep it low and let it work. And by the time it was done, it tasted like it had always existed. The women who made it this way are gone. The canned version is the only version most people have ever tasted. Every September, when the garden gave its last before the frost, out came the canning jars and the big enamel pot, and the kitchen spent a full day smelling like hot vinegar and pickling spice. Chow was the relish that used everything left over: green tomatoes, cabbage, onion, bell pepper, corn, okra, chopped fine and cooked down in a vinegar sugar mustard brine until the mixture went soft and tangy and the color shifted from bright green to a deep burnished gold. The African American Registry and food historians document chow as a creation of Black cooks in the South, a preservation technique born of the same waste-nothing philosophy that ran through every corner of these kitchens. Each cook had her own ratio: more sugar, more heat, a handful of celery seed, and those ratios were not written down. They were adjusted by taste every year the same way, which meant the only way to learn them was to stand next to her while she worked. The jars went into the pantry and came out over the winter on top of beans, on anything that needed a lift. Long before a movie made them famous, fried green tomatoes were already a staple in Black Southern kitchens. Green tomatoes, picked before they ripened, were sliced thick and dredged in seasoned cornmeal or a cornmeal flour mixture, then fried in a cast iron skillet in hot lard until the coating went deep gold and the tomato inside went just soft, still firm at the center with a tartness that played directly against the richness of the fat. Food historians have traced the West African connection. Green tomatoes bear a strong resemblance in flavor and texture to unripe fruits that West African cooks used in savory preparations for centuries. In the 1960s Southern church kitchen, fried green tomatoes, arrived with the last of the summer garden, usually in late August, and they disappeared from the table the same way deviled eggs did. Quickly, without ceremony, because the people who wanted them knew there wouldn't be more until next year. Nobody who grew up eating hoghead cheese called it by its formal name when they were children, and nobody who didn't grow up eating it has ever been easy about hearing what it is. The pig's head, cleaned, split, and simmered for hours in seasoned water with onion, garlic, bay leaf, and vinegar until the meat fell from the bone, was picked clean by hand, chopped, mixed with the gelatin-rich broth, and poured into a pan to set overnight. What came out was a firm, sliceable terrine that tasted of deep pork and pickling spice, served thin on crackers or white bread with hot sauce. Mashed has documented hoghead cheese as among the disappearing soul food dishes of the American South, noting the technique requires butchering knowledge most households no longer carry. In the 1960s, the grandmother who made it didn't explain herself. She set it on the table and watched the same people who made faces at the description reach for a second piece before the first was gone. That was the whole point. Pig ear sandwiches were sold from black-owned lunch counters and home kitchens across the South through the 1950s and 60s, and eating one was a specific pleasure that required no apology. Pig ears, documented as part of the food ration distributed to enslaved people on southern plantations, were boiled until tender, sometimes breaded and fried, then stacked on white bread with hot sauce, mustard, and onion. The texture is unlike anything else, firm and cartilaginous at the center, almost silky at the edge, with a clean pork flavor that holds up the heat and vinegar. MASH documents pig ear sandwiches as a vanishing soul food tradition, the cultural knowledge belonging almost entirely to a generation now elderly or gone. There were lunch counter women in Birmingham and Memphis who made them by the dozens every Friday. Their names are not recorded anywhere. The counters closed, the buildings changed, and the sandwiches went with them, a loss that only the people who ate them can fully measure. Short ribs of beef arrived at the soul food table by a familiar route. They were a cut the butcher priced low because the work seemed to outweigh the return. That calculus was wrong. Braised low and slow in a heavy pot with onion, garlic, tomato, vinegar, thyme, and bay, the collagen in the bone dissolved into the liquid and turned it glossy and rich, filling the kitchen with the smell that sat in your clothes for the rest of the day. Britannica documents short ribs as among the foundational proteins of American soul food, transforming a tough, inexpensive cut into something that requires skill and time. By the time the lid came off, the bone pulled away with 2 fingers. What that dish needed was someone who had started the pot early, enough. Someone who planned ahead for the people she loved. The mason jar of pickled pig's feet at the back of the refrigerator was not for everyone, and the people who kept it there knew that. Pig's feet, slow cooked for hours until the skin softened and the small bones pulled free, were packed into jars with white vinegar, hot pepper, garlic, and pickling spice, then left to sit for days until the brine had worked all the way through. The Florida Avenue Grill in Washington, D.C., one of the oldest soul food establishments in the country, kept pickled pig's feet on the menu from its earliest days, and the African American Registry documents them as a staple stretching back through the plantation kitchen. In the 1960s, the jar came out on weekends, eaten cold, straight from the brine with hot sauce at the kitchen table with no occasion required. There was always one person in the family who maintained the knowledge of how to make them. When that person was gone, the jar disappeared too, and no one thought to ask for the recipe before it was too late. Succotash in the soul food kitchen was not the pale side dish the name eventually came to suggest. It was a full, deeply seasoned stew, corn cut from the cob, lima beans or butter beans, okra sliced thin, cooked down with a ham hock, and finished with a hand of butter. The dish moves across two traditions. Its structure is Native American in origin, documented among the Narragansett people as succotash, a corn and bean preparation, while its depth came from the seasoning and the pork that African American cooks brought to it over generations. The African American Registry traces this convergence directly, as does Taste of Home's documentation of the dish in the Southern tradition. In the 1960s, succotash appeared at church suppers in the summer, made from whatever the garden had yielded. It tasted different each time, sweeter when the corn was younger, richer when the beans had cooked longer. And the version your grandmother made in her kitchen, with her hand in the butter at the end, does not exist anywhere anymore. Beef tongue was the cut that required confidence from the cook and trust from the table. A whole cow's tongue, 3 to 4 pounds, dense and smooth, went into a pot with onion, garlic, bay leaf, and black peppercorns, and simmered for 3 to 4 hours until a skewer passed through with no resistance. Then it came out and the peeling began. The thick outer skin pulled away in sections, while the meat was still hot, revealing a grain so fine and a texture so tender that even skeptical guests left converted. The African American Registry documents beef tongue as a soul food staple, a cut priced low at the butcher because most customers passed it over. Sliced thin and served with braised greens or over rice, it carried a deep, clean beef flavor no roast could match. The cook, who knew the exact moment the skin would release, had a skill that lived in her hands alone. Soul food meatloaf was not the same dish as the meatloaf at a church potluck in Iowa, and anyone who has eaten both knows the difference without being able to fully explain it. The Black American version was built on ground beef mixed with sautéed onion, bell pepper, garlic, and celery. The holy trinity of seasoning that shows up across almost every dish in this tradition, along with egg, breadcrumbs, soaked in milk, Worcestershire, and enough black pepper to make itself known. It was baked in a loaf pan and smothered in a brown gravy made from the drippings, thick enough to pool on the plate and to be sopped up with cornbread. Mickey's Soul Food Cafe in Chicago and similar institutions built their weekday lunch trade around this dish. At home, soul food meatloaf was Tuesday or Wednesday food, a dish that appeared in the middle of the week when the Sunday roast was gone. The woman who made it is gone now too, and the specific heat of her pepper, the exact shade of that gravy, those are not measurements anyone wrote down. Before the week's gravy could be forgotten, there was another use for the hot cast iron that never required a recipe and never needed an occasion. Chicken livers, small, dark, inexpensive, and almost universally misunderstood by anyone who hadn't grown up eating them, were rinsed, patted dry, dredged in seasoned flour with salt, black pepper, garlic powder, and cayenne, and dropped into a skillet of hot oil where they fried fast 4 minutes aside, the outside going brown and crisp while the inside stayed just barely pink at the center. The African American Registry documents fried chicken livers as a soul food staple, a dish that transformed a cut most supermarkets now sell as pet food into something rich, mineral, and deeply satisfying. The secret was the doneness. The overcooked liver turns grainy and bitter, and knowing the exact moment to pull it from the oil was information that passed by watching, never by instruction. You either learned it at that stove or you didn't learn it at all. The pan-fried pork chop required nothing: salt, black pepper, a cast iron skillet, and heat. A bone-in chop, 1 inch thick, seasoned on both sides, dredged lightly in flour, and laid flat in a skillet of hot lard where it cooked for 5 to 6 minutes aside without being touched until it was ready to be turned. Mrs. White's Golden Rule Cafe in Phoenix, operating from the early 1960s, built a devoted following on exactly this standard. Simple, unadorned, honest. The crust that formed was golden and firm. The meat underneath stayed juicy because the flour seal had held. Across black households, from Georgia to California in those years, this dish proved you didn't need anything extra when you knew what you were doing. She knew what she was doing. That simplicity was his own kind of mastery, and the people who understood it are mostly gone now. Nobody at the family reunion ever said whose potato salad was best out loud. They didn't have to. You watched where people went back for a second helping and who got skipped on a third pass, and you knew. Potato salad in the African American tradition was a deeply personal dish. Boiled potatoes, hard-boiled eggs, celery, onion, sweet pickle relish, Duke's mayonnaise, yellow mustard, and a seasoning hand that no two cooks shared. The Soul Food Pot documents it as perhaps the most fiercely contested dish at any black family gathering, the one that sparked the most kitchen politics and the most careful diplomacy. The unwritten rule was that you did not volunteer your opinion unless asked. If you were the maker of the best potato salad at the table, you said nothing and let the empty bowl speak. She always made the best potato salad. She never bragged about it once. And the specific ratio in her bowl, the amount of mustard that gave it that slight tang, the way she cut the egg, went with her when she left, and nothing at the table has tasted quite right since. Leah Chase ran Dookie Chase's restaurant in New Orleans from the 1950s onward, feeding civil rights leaders, musicians, and politicians, and becoming nationally recognized in the 60s as one of the foremost figures in Creole soul food. Her stuffed shrimp were among the dishes that defined what Dookie Chases meant to the culture. Large Gulf shrimp, butterflied open and filled with the savory bread, stuffing seasoned with onion, celery, bell pepper, and Creole spice, the same base that runs through the whole canon of Louisiana black cooking, then baked until the stuffing set and the shrimp curled tight around it. The technique was Creole in structure, but soul food in spirit, two traditions built by black cooks cooking the same way for the same reasons across different geographies. Chase said that through food you could change minds and attitudes. She fed people who disagreed about everything, and they ate at the same table, and for a while the food was the only conversation required. That kind of cooking was a skill and a philosophy at the same time. Sweet potato and pork stew arrived on the soul food table from two directions at once. West African cooking had long paired yams and sweet tubers with braised pork and aromatic broth. Enslaved Africans brought that sensibility to southern kitchens where sweet potatoes grew abundantly in the sandy coastal soil. The stew that resulted was slow and humble: cubed sweet potato, pork shoulder or neck bones, onion, garlic, and a little broth, cooked low for 2 hours until the sweet potato had partly dissolved into the liquid and thickened it to something between a stew and a gravy, the pork falling apart at the touch of a fork. It was the kind of dish you started early in the afternoon and let do its work while you did yours. By the time it was ready, the kitchen was warm and the smell had been there long enough to feel permanent. She made it every November. The last November she was well enough to stand at that stove was the last time it was made in that house, and nobody has thought to start it since. Molasses-glazed spare ribs were the indoor rib, the winter rib, the rib made by women who cooked in kitchens and not at pits, and they were different from barbecue in ways that mattered. The ribs went into the oven low and slow, braised in a shallow pan with a little water or cider vinegar to keep them from drying out, covered in foil for the first 2 hours while the collagen worked loose. Then the foil came off and the glaze went on. Dark molasses mixed with vinegar, black pepper, a little mustard, and whatever else the cook kept near the stove. The ribs went back in uncovered, and the glaze caramelized slowly, going sticky and dark at the edges and almost lacquer bright in the center. In black households across the South and North in the 1950s and 60s, this was how ribs were made at home when the weather was cold and the backyard was not an option. The woman who made them is gone now, and the molasses jar still sits at the back of the pantry where she left it, and no one has opened it since. Long before the smokehouse went quiet, there was a sound on the streets of New Orleans that meant breakfast, a woman's voice in French Creole calling out over a basket balanced on her head, hot rice fritters rising from a cold brazier. Calas were the original banned soul food. Deep-fried rice cakes made from leftover rice, flour, eggs, sugar, and nutmeg, sold by black women in the French Quarter since the 1700s, when the Code Noir gave enslaved women Sundays off to sell food and earn their own money. By the 1920s, vending ordinances pushed the women off the streets. The city wanted cleaner sidewalks. What it erased was a tradition connecting back to West African rice culture, the Wolof and Mandinka peoples who cultivated the grain that built Louisiana's economy. Rose Nicole, the most famous Calas seller, purchased her freedom with fritter money earned outside Sunday Mass. By the 1930s, the collar women were gone. The sound went with them. The bottle sat right next to the stove, apple cider vinegar, cap already loose because she reached for it so often. A splash went into the greens. A pour went into the beans. A few drops finished the broth. It sharpened everything, cut through the pork fat, and gave the pot a brightness that balanced the smoke and salt. Nobody explained why, you just did it because she did it. Acetic acid increases the solubility of non-heme iron, the kind in plant foods, making it far easier for the body to absorb. That splash also lowers the pH of the cooking liquid, preserving heat-sensitive vitamins like C and thiamine that degrade during long simmering. Vinegar is also a natural antimicrobial that inhibits harmful bacteria in stored food. She was boosting mineral absorption, preserving vitamins, and extending food safety with one twist of a bottle cap, and she never once called it science. No buttermilk meant a 10-second fix. You took whatever milk was left, poured a cup, added a tablespoon of white vinegar or lemon juice, stirred it twice, and let it sit for 5 minutes. What came back was close enough in chemistry to do the job. The acid had begun curdling the milk protein slightly, creating the tangy consistency that activates baking soda the way true buttermilk does. The acid-base reaction between buttermilk and baking soda is what produces the rise in quick breads. Carbon dioxide bubbles from chemistry, not just heat. African American bakers in the rural South, especially during the 1940s and 50s, when fresh buttermilk wasn't always available, knew this substitution by instinct. They didn't need a food chemistry textbook. They needed biscuits on the table by 6 in the morning, and the vinegar trick made that possible with whatever was left in the house. Before the supplement aisle existed, there was a quieter kind of kitchen science, one that saved civilizations. Women took dried field corn and soaked it in lye water made from hardwood ashes, stirring with long wooden paddles as the kernels swelled and the hulls loosened. What emerged was hominy, puffed, white, tender enough to eat whole or grind into grits. The process, learned from Native American neighbors as early as the 1800s, is called nixtamalization. Europeans who brought corn across the Atlantic skipped this step, and over 100,000 Americans died from pellagra, a niacin deficiency caused by corn that locks away its B3 behind chemical bonds the body cannot break without alkaline processing. Nixtamalization releases that bound niacin, increases calcium by 750%, improves protein quality, and destroys 90% of mycotoxins. The women who stirred that lye pot were performing biochemistry. They just called it making hominy. There was always a tin. It sat near the burner, dented and dark, with a lid that never quite closed right, and it was one of the most important pieces of equipment in the kitchen. Every time something came out of a pan, the drippings went in. The fat from salt pork, the leavings after the sausage was done, the amber oil left after cornbread came out. By the end of the week, that tin held a layered history of everything cooked, and it was the starting fat for nearly everything baked. Bacon grease keeps baked goods from sticking in a way butter never can. The smoke point is higher, the flavor deeper, and the way it coats seasoned cast iron before baking creates a seal that Crisco or spray oil cannot replicate. African American families across the South carried this practice from the 19th century straight through the 1970s. The ones who kept their tin long after health trends said otherwise. Their cornbread tasted different, richer, like something had been built into it slowly over years, because it had. Before anyone called it a crime, there was a kitchen in Harlem where a woman boiled pig feet in a pot so big it took up half the stove. Pig feet were the centerpiece of rent parties, illegal apartment gatherings where tenants charged a quarter at the door and served plates alongside bootleg gin just to make rent. Langston Hughes saved hand-printed party tickets in a red box. The feet simmered for hours in vinegar, onion, garlic, and crushed red pepper until the cartilage turned to silk. They were served on wax paper with hot sauce, eaten standing up because the furniture was pushed against the walls for dancing. The Volstead Act made the gin illegal. Jim Crow made the gathering dangerous, but every Saturday night, those kitchens opened anyway, and the smell drifted through hallways where Fats Waller played piano for a plate and $1. Nobody throws those parties anymore. She kept it next to the salt, a Folgers can with a bent spoon, sitting in cool bacon drippings, and whatever rendered off last night's dinner. Every black kitchen had one. Nutritionists called it a heart attack in a can. The American Heart Association told families to pour the grease down the drain and buy vegetable oil. But that recycled fat was mostly monounsaturated and saturated, both chemically stable at frying temperatures. The polyunsaturated seed oils that replaced it oxidized under heat, producing toxic aldehydes linked to inflammation. A study at De Montfort University found that lard generated far fewer harmful compounds during high heat cooking than sunflower or corn oil. She strained the fat through cheesecloth, let it cool, and spooned it back for tomorrow. That bent spoon in the Folgers can hold more wisdom than a decade of government food pyramids. You could hear it before you saw it. The moment that batter hit the iron, there was a sound, a hard, immediate sizzle, like the pan was sealing a deal, and you knew the crust was already forming on the bottom before the top had even set. That sound was the trick. The cast iron had been heating in the oven for at least 10 minutes, and when cold batter touched that surface, the fat drove moisture into instant steam, puffing the inside while the outside crisped. This is why cornbread baked in a cold dish and cornbread baked in a screaming hot cast iron are two entirely different creatures from the exact same batter. African American cooks across the South understood this long before food science had a word for it, the Skillet went in first always, and the batter went in last. You poured fast because every second of contact between cold batter and hot iron was building that crust. The dark gold bottom, slightly smoky from the seasoned surface, that was not an accident. That was something learned by listening. These kitchens went quiet and took their knowledge with them. If you ate at one of those tables, leave a name in the comments.